Everybody, I'm Eli Noam, a professor at Columbia University and director of CITI. CITI is the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation, a research center and institute that is dealing with economics and policy and management and forward-looking and backward-looking type issues in the digital environment and media environment. We're not affiliated with any point of view as a group. We, of course, have our own individual opinions, but collectively, all opinions are welcome, all perspectives are welcome. We've had more than 75 books over the years. We have books, for example, recently 2 books on managing digital operations that had 1.9 and 1.8 million full downloads. We have books on next generation media, including 2 recent books on streaming video and a book in progress on the metaverses. We have but in particular, we do a lot on policy, international policy too. Goes back to books a long time ago on telecom and reforms in Europe and Latin America, Africa, and Asia, on television transformation in Europe, et cetera, et cetera. And a book 6 years ago on media concentration and ownership around the world. So we did a lot on digital policy, and we did a lot of international, but we did not join the 2 dimensions in one focused way. So we concluded that we wanted to do it in a more targeted effort. Is this important? I don't think we need to explain this to this audience. There was a time, a long time ago, when everybody believed that the internet was outside the reach of governments. I disagreed. Wired magazine ran a story with a heading at the time, "Yes, kiddies, one can regulate the internet." This and other heresies by Eli Noam, heresies. Now it's more like platitudes. Today, various rules and regulations are all over the world, some of them governmental, some of them are private, some of them are private imposed by governments. And because online activities are global, these rules have transnational effects. Just look at the European privacy regulations. So the international interplay in digital policy is a critical aspect of the digital economy and society.
Yeah.
Ignore it at your peril. And because it is so important, we brought in Dr. William J. Drake to do so. He has become Citi's new Director for International Studies. He will also be co-teaching a course on the subject at Columbia. Bill Drake is well known in this area. I don't have to give you a long bio, but I'll give you a very short one. In addition to his new position as Director of International Studies at the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation, he has been, and I really have to compress this, he has been at the University of Zurich, at the Carnegie Endowment, at Georgetown University, at the University of California in San Diego, with the World Economic Forum, with the Internet, with ICANN, with IGF, and he's been active and involved, and he's been pretty much crossing everybody's path over the past years. And so as part of these activities, Bill has started, and CITI have started this monthly seminar series, and you will hear about it in a moment. The topic is the Bucharest Plenipot. I will not go into that detail, but as they say, you always remember your first time. My first time, my first Plenipot was in Nice in 1989, which dates myself. And then Geneva, and then I don't remember. But I do remember how long and involved these meetings were, how many serious people were spending so much serious time. For example, I was invited to speak to a subcommittee. And naive me at the time, I thought I would address, subcommittee, 12 people. But it was a subcommittee not of 12, but of 1,200 people. So the plenipots have become more important and probably larger than ever, not necessarily shorter than ever, though. So we are grateful for this panel to try to explain to the rest of us what has been accomplished recently in a compressed form. And about the digital governance of this event on digital governance, I should say. This event here is on the record. It will be recorded, is being recorded already, and then put on YouTube as well as posted on our website. And that will be by about Thursday. And I want to use this opportunity to recognize our Executive Director, Jason Buckwrights, for running this event. Thanks, Jason. So welcome you in the audience worldwide. Welcome Digital Governance webinar. Welcome great speakers about the Plenipot, and welcome back to Columbia, Bill Drake.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. And it is indeed back to Columbia. I met Ellie in 1983 and have been affiliated when I was a graduate student, and I've been affiliated with CIT ever since. Actually, Ellie, 1989 Nice Plenipotentiary, I was there too. And it was different then, because back then the plenipotentiaries went on for 5 weeks, which provided attendees with ample opportunities for strolling along the promenade and people watching and not being too stressed. Now they compressed down to 3 weeks, and the first week is lost to elections. So really all the work is done in 2 weeks, which is, I think, impacts the outcomes. So, but we can talk about that later. Let me just back up first and just say a word about the series, and then introduce the panel and the topic for today. So the series, you know, despite our best efforts in the working group in internet governance back during the World Summit of the Information Society in developing a definition of internet governance that was adopted in the United Nations, the notion of governance and global governance still remains contested in a lot of circles, as does the notion of digital governance, exactly how broadly one construes that and so on. This might be an interesting thing to have a conversation about sometime in this webinar, but for now we'll set aside definitional discussions and just take a broadly inclusive framing as a starting point. We're talking here about the international rules of the game set by states and stakeholders for digital communications and information networks and related technologies. So that encompasses both the traditional sort of international regimes and arrangements for telecom, satellites, trade over networks, and so on that dealt with digital technologies, the kind of mechanisms created since the 1980s for internet governance, and the new efforts to establish shared rules of the game internationally for things like data, artificial intelligence, social media, and so on. So we're taking a broadly inclusive view here of the terrain, which is a really complex set of institutional arrangements, an ecosystem comprising multiple regime complexes. And we're going to talk about the analytical and policy issues that arise across that heatedly contested set of spaces. And the hope for this series is that we'll find a sweet spot between academic discussions and practitioner-oriented discussions, a la what goes on in the Internet Governance Forum, and create a space for interactions between international meetings and negotiations for all the folks who float around in this space, especially the internet governance space. So the hope is that we will be creating sort of a digital water cooler for policy wonks who are interested in these issues. And looking at the list of people who are attending, I think we have reason to believe that there's interest among people who have a lot of deep experience and expertise. So future meetings we'll have, the next one will be Thursday, November 17th on Internet Fragmentation Reconsidered, and January 19th on Wither, the Internet Governance Forum. Future topics we'll probably get into things like the UN Global Digital Compact, the World Trade Organization's global trade negotiations on digital, ICANN 7 years on, digital national security and sovereignty, China and digital Cold War debate, all these kinds of issues and more. And we're open to suggestions from people as to what topics we might want to get into. So that's the series in a nutshell. So turning to today's topic, the ITU plenipotentiary and internet governance. Of course, the ITU has a long and storied history with many contributions to the development of global connectivity. From 1865 to the mid-1980s, we had a long century of sort of monopoly control at the national level by PTTs in the telecom environment, which impacted the kinds of international arrangements that were negotiated for telecom operating agreements, standards, and so on, the international regime. But really, by the late 1980s, the centrality of the ITU's rules and processes in telecom markets and standards began to slip due to the asymmetric spread of liberalization and privatization, the movement of standards to other new standards bodies, the development of new modes of operation like resale and voice over the internet, the collapse of the international accounting and settlement system, the entry of the World Trade Organization into the space, et cetera. So that by the early 1990s, when the internet, TCP/IP-based internet began to take off, there was a certain amount of suspicion and wariness in some quarters of the ITU environment about the internet, which was viewed less as a sort of exciting opportunity and more as sort of a problematic challenge to the organization and to the strength of its arrangements. I spent 5 summers in the early 1990s in offices provided by the Secretary General doing research. And I remember back then people talked about the internet, sometimes both people on the staff, but also governments and others floating around the process. Some people talked about it as just an academic plaything that you didn't have to worry about. And others worried that it was a US conspiracy against the ITU's open system interconnection model, which in the end it did blow away. But there was a sort of concern from the outset. And then as things went on, we had in 1997, the whole GTLD MOU play for an effort to try to create a central role for the ITU in the management of internet infrastructure. I still remember the press release from the ITU saying 80 organizations agreed to restructure the internet, which began a whole long series of unfortunate dynamics with a significant number of member states refusing to sort of acknowledge ICANN after it was created, that it was effective, that it was an appropriate place to manage names and numbers. Criticism of the Government Advisory Committee of ICANN is woefully inadequate, et cetera. Calls for the ITU to effectively supplant ICANN's role in internet governance, sometimes amplified by the organization's leadership. And so, throughout the World Summit of the Information Society Phase 1, there was this whole unproductive debate about the ITU versus ICANN, which died down subsequently, but still many governments have not sort of let go of the idea that the ITU mechanisms can be leveraged to increase state and intergovernmental control over the internet. And this really came to a head, of course, in Dubai in 2012, the World Conference on International Telecommunications, which was supposed to revise the antiquated international telecommunication regulations. And this turned into like a major geopolitical battle as some governments made proposals extending treaty regulations over various aspects of the internet, often quite rigorously. And this was, of course, heatedly opposed by others, all of which resulted in the biggest diplomatic catastrophe in the history of international telecom diplomacy, with 55 countries, including all the industrialized world, voting against the treaty, and 89 countries voting in support of it. So this was an indication that it's difficult in a multilateral intergovernmental setting to agree on strong mechanisms impacting internet and internet governance. So, and there's many reasons for why this difference of views exists among governments, which we can get into, but the net result is that the relationship between the ITU and internet governance has been fraught for 25 years. And so it's in that context then that it's interesting to evaluate the Plenipotentiary Conference that just happened and take stock of the meeting and try to assess how much it matters. There are those who, of course, follow the geopolitics of internet governance who think it matters a great deal what governments are saying and doing in multilateral institutions around internet issues. And there are others who will say that it doesn't matter what these guys are talking about. At the end of the day, names, numbers, interconnection, all these things are being done in other places, and that won't be impacted. So there's a lot to think about here, and we have a very good group of people with which to do that. We unfortunately lost 2 speakers to family emergencies yesterday, but we were lucky to recruit one person to replace, so we have 3. Samantha Dickinson is joining us from Australia. She's a writer and internet governance consultant at Linguist Synaptica with expertise in explaining internet governance related issues. She live tweets internet governance related meetings from around the world on a full-time basis. Sam is followed by people all around the world in various stakeholder environments, including government, private sector, technical community, et cetera. And she live tweeted the ITU's meeting, in the Plenipotentiary meeting in a very helpful way, I must say. So she's joining us from there. We have Nermeen Al-Sadeh. She is joining us from Cairo, Egypt. She's the regional vice president for the Middle East of the Internet Society. Previously, Nermeen had a long career at the Ministry of Communications and Information Technology of the government of Egypt, including serving for several years as Undersecretary for International Relations. Nermeen has extensive experience in both the intergovernmental organizations like ITU and multi-stakeholder organizations and processes like ICANN and the IGF. And she was at the Plenipotentiary Conference. Finally, we have Wolfgang Kleinvictor, who is Professor Emeritus for International Communications Policy and Regulation from the University of Aarhus in Denmark, and is the founder and chair of the European Summer School of Internet Governance. Many people, of course, know Wolfgang is a global man about town, who's been a member of the UN Working Group in Internet Governance, the Global Commission Stability in Cyberspace, an advisor to the Internet Governance Forum, member of the UN CSTD, IGF Improvement Working Group, member of the ICANN's Board of Directors and the GNSO Council, the head of the nominating committee in ICANN, co-founder of European Dialogue and Internet Governance. I could go on and on. Wolfgang has been very involved in everything, and he's joining us from Germany. So we'll do 2.5 clusters of issues for about 50 minutes to an hour, depending on how the conversation goes. We'll talk first about general thoughts about the ITU and its role in internet governance and takeaways from the Plenipot. Then we'll do a little dive into some of the long-running institutional issues concerning the ITU's role in internet issues, and then finally briefly touch on some other miscellaneous issues that we maybe haven't touched on before. And then we'll open it to conversation. And again, looking at the group here that we have, I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a robust and lively dialogue going forward. So that's my long-winded introduction to the seminar and the session. So with all that said, then let us begin by talking first about opening thoughts about the ITU and its role in internet governance, and big picture takeaways on the plenipotentiary in Bucharest, how people see everything having evolved. Can I ask the three panelists maybe to start by giving us your big picture elevator summary? Coming out of the meeting, what's the ITU's position in the internet governance space? Has there been any change in any direction? Are we at a turning point, in a renaissance, as Tony Rukowski recently wrote in Circle ID, or is it just a status quo kind of outcome in terms of internet issues, or something else? You know, do we see movement change? What is your general assessment? Which of you would like to start us off? Wolfgang?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for the introduction. And I just came back from Bucharest. I was there and as member of the German governmental delegation, but as an independent expert. And for me, it was an interesting, I would not say déjà vu, but, you know, I'm involved in this debate since more than 20 years. And when Bill more or less gave a resume about the long conflict between ICANN and the ITU, I remembered all the Secretary Generals of the ITU, starting with Pekka Tarjano, who wanted to keep the management of the domain name system under the ITU, and he celebrated the MOU, the new GTLD interim ad hoc committee MOU, as a turning point in international law, as a mixture with the ITU in control. And then Utsumi, you know, he lost the battle in the WSIS when he wanted to use WSIS to get the control over the domain name system back. And then it was Hamadou Touré who came to the ICANN meeting in Cairo and talking to the members of the governmental advisory committee and ICANN and saying, why are you sitting here? You have just advisory capacity, and I can, you know, come back to the ITU. You have a voting power. And then been the interesting start of the new beginning after the collapse of Dubai in Wicked, what in 2012, Bill remembered this big thing was that Hu Jintao, when he was elected, a lot in the West said, oh my goodness, now a guy from China is the Secretary General of the ITU. But Hu Jintao was very balanced. So he came to an ITF meeting, and we, had a T-shirt from an ITF meeting and said, I'm one of you guys. He came to the ICANN meeting in Abu Dhabi when Steve Crocker had his, last party and, celebrated Steve Crocker from the ICANN community. So Hu Jintao was already a bridge, and now we have this American woman, which will be which is rather different from the other candidate, which was the former Russian vice minister for telecommunication, Rashid Ismailov. By the way, a very nice and experienced guy, so he has all his qualifications. But if you put this in the context of the ITU-ICANN controversy over more than 20 years, then Doreen was in her first interviews very outspoken and said, certainly, we have still the footnote in the resolution 102 and some others. So we have not on paper really an equal footing between ITU and the so-called ISTAR organizations, including ICANN. But she made very clear that she will have a very constructive and good relationship with ICANN. So this is, let's say, a change over 20 years. But the big takeaway from Bucharest, in my eyes, is that it's rather irrelevant now. So 20 years ago, it was really a battle about who controls the internet. The ICANN was labeled, which was wrong from the very early moment, as the world government of the internet. And some people or some governments in the ITU dreamed that the ITU could become the world government of the internet, that the United Nations, and on behalf of the United Nations, the ITU, take over the control of the internet. But as we have learned in the last 20 years, there is neither a world government of the internet, nor somebody can overtake the internet. So it's such a decentralized networks where certainly, the battle over key aspects of the internet will continue. But my expectations also, with what I heard in the conference halls in Bucharest now. So the big battle will continue, but has moved outside the halls of the ITU and ICANN. I think after the Jana transition under Göran, ICANN already, said, okay, it's not good for ICANN and the management of such a critical resource as the domain name system if we are in the line of fire of political battles. I think Fadi Shehadeh was different. He was looking for the line of fire, and probably also after Wicked, the Net Mundial, and was an important element to make very clear, why we need the multi-stakeholder approach for the management of the internet and leave it not in the hand of governments. So, but Göran said, okay, now we have the Jana transition, let's move outside of the line of fire. And my impression from Bucharest is that now ITU says, why we should in the line of fire? So we have other bigger challenges to connect the unconnected. And so what I see is a shift into more practical things in the ITU, because the big battle on the future of the internet, the political battle, has moved now to cybersecurity issues. And here we have other bodies like the Open-Ended Working Group in the First Committee, like the treaty negotiations on the Cybercrime Convention, like probably the negotiations on internet-based weapon system, autonomous weapon systems. So I think this will be the big battle, and this is a battle between China and the United States of America, or you could say between the Declaration on the Future of the Internet and the new plans in China on the institutionalization of the World Internet Conference of Wuzhen. This is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization versus the G7, but it's not anymore ICANN versus ITU. So that means ICANN and ITU have rediscovered their key business. The core business of ICANN is management of the DNS. The core business of the ITU is frequency, is orbit, and it's certainly development and even the standardization question, which raised a lot of eyebrows after Chinese initiatives with new IP or IP version 6+ and some others. I think Chinese experts have also realized probably ITU remains a key player in the field of standardization. But a lot of standardization will be done by other standardization organizations, by other SDOs for mobile communication, for the metaverse and some others. Certainly study group 20 is an issue. Smart cities, a lot of surveillance technology is standardized in study group 20, so Internet of Things could play a role. But my main conclusion, and this is the end for my first intervention, is ICANN and ITU, the conflict is not anymore in the line of fire. There is overlapping, there will be competition, but I do not expect that we will see big interference of ITU into the DNS, and ICANN will probably strengthen its role in the ITU-D sector, and development will be more important than standardizations in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
All right, fantastic. That was quite a tour de horizon, Wolfgang. All the other panelists, of course, shouldn't feel like they have to be as expansive, but we absolutely want to get everybody's voice on, into the mix. So, okay, let's hear from others. Nermeen, would you like to follow up?
Yes, thank you, Bill. And actually, I would love to second Wolfgang in some of his remarks. But let me start, since I have been also maybe had the chance to be within the ITU Plenipotentiary Conference since 2002. I know I'm not that old in attending ITU meetings, but from the interval that I have been attending and from the 2 hats that I have been attending, the plenipotentiary, being a government official and sometimes leading my government, Egypt, at that point in time within the ITU Plenipotentiary Conferences, and now as an ISOC member, I can just share with you some of the general mood of the plenipotentiary in general in Bucharest. So when it comes to delegates and how the regional groups were interacting with one another, I would say there was a sense of maturity in the way they are negotiating, in the way they have been studying so far the issues that they would like to defend, and they know how to defend them, whether we agree or disagree with the content that they are contesting or discussing. However, of course, we can see as well many new faces around this plenipotentiary in general, and you can sense general implications for the general politics worldwide. So the Ukraine and Russia war, for instance, has its impact not only on the elections, of course, but also in some of the discussions as we move forward. You know, whenever you can see Russia say something, you can find the US say another thing, just to make the point that we are on different poles from that point or from the other. As Wolfgang as well has mentioned, having Doreen on the top of the organization, I think would shed some new dimensions, and I would say new vibes, being the first woman handling this position ever, coming from the US in origin. She has been with ITU for years now, but still she has the US citizenship, and she has been, and this is more important in my opinion, she has been the director of the Development Bureau, at least for the previous term, for 4 years, and she has been always advocate for the development sector within the ITU. And the development sector, in my opinion, would play a critical role in the coming at least 4 or 5 years to go. And the elections of the Bureau director was not, in my opinion, I don't know how to say it, but you know, we have gone through four rounds, I think, of elections so that we can actually, or they can elect the director of the Bureau. And I think she will have, as a Secretary General, she will have to focus on the development sector, give it or provide it with some empowerment so that they can fulfill its role. I don't know if we should here go into more details about the ICANN ITU kind of discussion, but I would agree with what was said by Wolfgang, that maybe the discussion will not be as strong as it used to be before. In the coming era, I think other platforms should or will witness some of the discussions related to the governance of the internet more than the plenipotentiary as we move forward. And that's all for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nermeen. Samantha, what do you think about, what's your big takeaway from watching all this and live tweeting endless sessions?
Well, the first thing about tweeting is that I actually don't remember a lot from the conference, because what I do is I literally hear, type, and it goes away. And then I do the next tweet. So, you know, I don't have a detailed knowledge of what actually happened at the meeting. So again, I had to go back through and look at some of my tweets and some of the resolutions to try and understand actually what happened. I think the first thing is that when you talk about what is ITU's position in the IG space, there is no one ITU. I mean, there is the Secretariat, there's the membership, there's 3 different bureaus. Yeah, like there's a lot of aspects to ITU. It's like saying that the GNSO position at ICANN represents ICANN. Yeah, there are different facets. So what's going to happen after this plenipot is all of those resolutions that they agree to are going to go to various other ITU related meetings, and they're going to debate what they actually mean and reinterpret them. So what we think has come out of this meeting isn't necessarily what's going to happen or be acted on. I think that's an important thing to remember. In terms of what came out of this plenipot for the internet world, I think it's a mixed bag. In some ways it was good. So there is now, being very detailed, text in Resolution 102, which is the International Internet-related Public Policy Issues resolution that refers to the Council Working Group on Internet. There is now text in there that says that it's an operative thing. It resolves, and I did write the text down, that ITU may assist member states to identify and access the advice and support that is available from other relevant entities and organisations, which is a further enmeshing of ITU with the existing internet laws that are in that famous internet footnote. But there's also some other areas that they're not a lot, like they weren't flashing alarm bells for this conference, but I think it's something to keep an eye on in future. One of the member states in discussing as Resolution 101 or 102, I can't remember, one of the internet resolutions, made a passing comment that everything telecommunications runs over the internet now. So that means, I mean, and telecommunications is the centre of ITU space. So if you're saying that everything that ITU does runs over the internet, well, that kind of opens up the possibility for more discussions about internet-related issues in future. I did take some notes. Yeah, that was the main one. In terms of the actual outcomes, not much changes in resolutions, because as Marcus Kummer would love to say, you know, everyone has to be equally unhappy. So what happens is all of the spiky bits that have come from different countries' proposals end up being hammered out into kind of like an equilibrium of blandness. So nothing really happens in the resolutions that is hugely progressive, but the interesting thing to watch is the proposals, because that gives us a good idea of what governments are thinking, and not just governments, because a lot of the positions of governments are also held by civil society or smaller businesses that are trying to make their way in this digital world that has already been colonized by a lot of the US-based multinationals. So it's a good, not alarm system, it's a good mechanism to follow the proposals, because if the existing multi-stakeholder bottom-up internet ecosystem doesn't pay attention to what the worries are, then it may be ITU, it may be the UN more generally, will start taking more actions in this space. And two of those areas in the internet space are IDNs, internationalized domain names, and the IPv6 adoption. You know, they've been taking a really long time in the internet world to be deployed and universally accepted. And so for countries that are finding this, who weren't early adopters of the internet, don't have huge stores of IPv4, they can use IPv6, but maybe other networks aren't accepting it, or they've got their local language IDN, but maybe Facebook's not allowing email addresses with that. So yeah, they're the sorts of things that if we don't address these concerns, they're going to become bigger problems down the line for us. So I guess ITU plenipotentiary is kind of like a canary in the coal mine kind of situation for me. Bill, you're on mute.
Thanks. Sorry. Thanks, Sam. Just let me ask, all of you who were there or following it closely, you participated actively and extensively in both multi-stakeholder and multilateral kind of settings. I just wonder how people saw the sort of dynamics around stakeholder participation, the treatment of stakeholders in this setting. Wolfgang mentioned having to be part of the German government delegation, and how the organizational process, the organization of the process itself, the timing, the working groups, all that, how that stuff impacted the kind of outcomes of the plenipotentiary with regard to internet issues, to the extent that there are outcomes that you think are notable. Any thoughts just briefly on that, on how the organizational process, the lay of the land, it mattered to things?
Probably I can make a comment from the experience just in Bucharest. You know, the ITU is an intergovernmental organization and will remain an intergovernmental organization. And that means they have a certain culture which is different from the multi-stakeholder culture. And the only way forward is to respect each other. And the problem in the past was that the multi-stakeholder management of the domain name system was criticized by some governments, saying, you know, it would be better if the domain name system would be managed under an intergovernmental regime. And this is why Russia, in the, let's say, introduced in Dubai the language of the national internet segment, and then pushed again and again for years to introduce via various channels a system where they can take away, you know, from ICANN the oversight or management of the DNS. The last ideas were to use the council working group on internet to start a public consultation based on the assumption that the DNS is broken and ICANN doesn't work, and we need a new system, and the better system could be developed within the ITU. So, and if you have followed this, what the Russian government wanted to have the last 5 years, and you compare it with what was achieved in Bucharest, you could say it's neither step forward nor backward. So it's more or less a status quo of coexistence, where the two organizations, you know, doing what they are did in the past, and the Russian proposal, you know, had no chance. If you go to the language of the resolution 102, so there is the same we had already, let's say, in Guadalajara and then in Busan and otherwise. So there is no new language which would justify future ITU conferences to try to take away some competences from ICANN or the regional internet registries. Some people will remember that ITU itself had sometimes a plan. It was not the member states, it was also Touré himself to get recognition as another RIR and to allocate IP addresses. So all this is gone. There is one new paragraph in the resolution 102 regarding CCTLDs, which is, has to be figured out, what does it mean? But the language is not really new. It is the paragraph, I think it's 69 from the Tunis agenda, where just governments reiterate that they have a sovereign right to organize their CCTLD. So this is not new language, but it's now an ITU document from the Tunis agenda, and more or less this is fine. Insofar, I think the status quo is, from a multi-stakeholder perspective, not such a bad thing. And it remains to be seen, how the various mix of different organizations, multi-stakeholder intergovernmental organization, can find together. But the ITU certainly is not open for non-state actors. They have this fixed small, the so-called sector members, the small m, and there was all efforts by some Western countries to open the Council Working Group for non-state actors, or to broaden the participation of non-state actors in intergovernmental elaborations, were blocked, mainly, by the way, by the Arab countries, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And insofar, ITU remains an intergovernmental organization, full stop. So, and it will not be the driver of the multi-stakeholder debate, but a lot of future internet discussions will take place outside of the ITU. So it doesn't matter. Let them do what they want. And for the radio regulations and for satellite communication and all this, so you need primarily the governments. I think this is also very understandable. And insofar, I think Nermin has, or Samantha has said, the ITU is a mix of different organizations. The D sector is different from the T sector. The R sector is different from the council and the secretariat. So, and insofar, from a multi-stakeholder perspective, the outcome of Bucharest is not so bad. There's no progress, but some people expected, sky will fall down to earth, if they elect the Russian Secretary General. They didn't elect the Russian, and there is no sign in, if you read the 500 pages of text, which were finally adopted, that via the ITU, governments try to overtake the internet. There are other places where there are efforts, but it will not be the ITU, in my after what I've experienced in Bucharest.
Thanks, Wolfgang. Either of the other panelists wish to speak to this? And of course, everybody's not obliged to speak to every topic, but I mean, if anybody wants to jump in, Nermin?
Yes, actually, it is correct that the ITU is an intergovernmental organization, and I would say that there will be no change in that particular point. And we saw quite a good discussion between the CEPT, as far as I remember, led by the UK, what they proposed in Resolution 102 to open the Council Working Group for stakeholders. And actually, they proposed to have them on 3 days. So 1 day open for all, and then I think the second day half open, half closed, something like this. I mean, the proposal. But in my opinion, personally, and how I read the discussion in that particular on that particular point, and before I move to my opinion, of course the Arab group and the African group from one side remain advocating for the closed Council Working Group and with the open consultation before the meeting takes place. But in my opinion, this again goes into the kind of negotiation that was taking place. So it's the hardcore the negotiation, when every party would be sticking 100% to his views until the very end, where we will see, and we have been seeing some flexibility in the different groups melting down their, fixed positions at the very beginning of the conference towards the end of it. If you compare it with the end or towards the end of the conference when we are stuck in time, especially the House of Parliament where the plenipotentiary in Bucharest was taking place, closes its doors at 9 p.m. So we didn't have the luxury of staying overnight or staying up till over midnight or something like this. We had to close before 9 p.m. So everyone was stuck, and everyone has to do, his negotiation tactics very quickly so that they can come up with the best they could. So multi-stakeholderism versus intergovernmental within the platform of the ITU, I think will remain the same. And we will remain seeing this kind of discussion, but nothing will happen, in my opinion.
Thanks. That's not entirely cheerful, but okay. Thank you. Sam, do you want to add anything on that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't there in person. I followed it remotely with my wallabies from Australia, but just some observations. So when you talk about it not being multi-stakeholder, a lot of the governments do have non-governmental folks on their delegations. One of the problems with that is quite frequently sorts of people that are on these delegations turn up once every 4 years. They don't participate in ITU at any other time. So if you just go to a plenipot, you are going to be completely bamboozled by the document system, what the various words of sensitivity are. You're not going to understand what's happening. So even though stakeholders can participate via governments or on sector member delegations, there's not the understanding necessarily. But an interesting thing that does happen is some of the proposals that go through that are not generally regional proposals, but are country or group of country proposals, they're often the result of a company having approached a particular government with a particular issue and wanting it discussed at ITU. So that's an interesting, not terribly visible process, but it is happening quietly. Those sorts of proposals don't tend to go anywhere because they're not a regional proposal, but it does show that there is influence of non-government folks into those discussions. Would I hold my head? Sorry, I'm just trying to read a chat in my... Okay, I'm holding it. I was trying to move my hair out the way, but obviously that wasn't enough. Yeah, so the other issue is that a lot of those discussions that happen at ITU are the same folks. It's like going to an ICANN meeting. You've got a core group of well-resourced companies, countries, in the case of ITU. Most of the developing countries do not follow ITU regularly. The countries that are purporting to represent developing country views are not necessarily developing countries, but developing countries will fall behind them because they'll see like the Arab group as being closer to their position than, say, the WEOG group. So the sorts of mechanisms and that are used at plenipotentiaries, these, you go from the plenary, you have then 6 committees and a working group of plenary, and under each of those, or some of those, you then have ad hocs, and under those you go into informal consultations. You cannot follow this. So if you're a small country or even a stakeholder, a sector member, you cannot follow all the issues you may want to. That's by having a time-limited conference in which decisions have to be made is very different to, say, the RIR or ICANN world, where things can happen over multiple cycles before a policy is developed. So I think that has an impact on how much does or doesn't get changed during plenipotentiaries. The other issue is that I think it was interesting. So this is kind of diverting from your direct question, Bill, but it was interesting to see how much ITU is trying to link in with other processes, particularly the UN processes. So it's trying to link in with the Summit of the Future and the Global Digital Compact. I think if we look long-term at this, ITU could be seen within the UN system as the overall digital head of coordination. So although I know Wolfgang and Namin have talked about ITU not being the centre of these digital debates, I wonder if long-term, because the UN system is going to need someone to coordinate all of this, that's going to be ITU. So I think that the fact that we saw a lot of discussions at this meeting to do with linking in with SDGs and with the Summit of the Future, they're trying to see how they can fit into that world. So that's something we should be keeping an eye on, I think.
Okay, thanks, Sam.
If I may, Rick, actually add to what Samantha was just saying, linking the discussion by some groups as well from the regional groups with what is happening at the UN platform is much more important, I would say, than the normal discussion that we see within the plenipotentiary. So linking or trying to find a link between the ITU and, for example, the new common agenda and the fora related that the SG of the UN has been calling upon was very interesting, I would say. And I think it will continue, this discussion will continue to take place, and I think it would need some attention from our side if we couldn't be interested.
Thank you, Noreen. Wolfgang, I would like to just move on a little quickly because, you know, we've got so many interesting people participating out there. I'd like to get their voices on to the table in 15 minutes or so, but I think we should touch on a few more specific issues first. We've done a sort of broadly inclusive sort of overviews of our general impressions, but there's a number of particular points that are worth flagging that were subject of a great deal of time and negotiation there. The internet resolutions, which go back to the 1998 Plenipotentiary in Minneapolis and have been sort of negotiated and revised at various points since and have grown from 2 to 5 resolutions, which have a lot of language that for various parties have been problematic. The discussion around the working group on international internet-related public policy, WISIS follow-up, cybersecurity, international telecom regulations. I mean, these are all big issues that I think we ought to say a little about just to get it on the table and then invite some of the experts participating into a broader discussion. So let's just say, if we could just, and if I can ask everybody on the panel to be concise and limit yourself to 2-minute responses so we can touch a few of these things. Just starting with the internet resolutions, you know, one of the big battles, of course, was the longstanding battle over the footnote, the famous footnote, the most discussed footnote in the history of the ITU, where ITU members have been unwilling to incorporate into the resolution about internet issues a direct mention of ICANN, IETF, the RARs, ISOC, Worldwide Web Consortium, et cetera. They've been relegated to a footnote since 2010. And there was a big fight over this issue, as always, with the Europeans proposing to move those organizations out of the cellar and into the text, and others arguing, no, we should just delete any mention of any of these organizations. There were debates over cooperation with multi-stakeholder processes and whether or not how exactly this should be framed. And you know, Europe again was proposing that we should acknowledge that the multi-stakeholder processes are working efficient and effectively and expand cooperation, and others having different kinds of views. There was debate over the retention of the ITU's references to the ITU's language on international interconnection charging, the famous D50 recommendation, which is kind of problematic. And next generation networks is still there for some reason. various proposals to maybe expand the mandate a bit by referencing within the resolutions 5G, AI, Internet of Things, big data, OTTs, all the rest. So there's quite a lot of interesting debates around the internet resolutions, as there always are. And I'm just wondering if I could get from folks a take on, what were the main dynamics there, what were the main outcomes? Who would like to start on that, on the internet resolutions?
I can start quickly if I may.
Yeah.
Wolfgang is okay that I start this time.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that if I can cluster the discussion when it comes to the Internet Resolution 101, 102, 133, I would say that, of course, the footnote was key in the discussion, where we saw a proposal from the CEPT group to move the footnote into the body of the resolution itself. I think it was like a self-defense against the proposal from the Arab group, mainly to delete the footnote altogether. But I have to mention here a point that was raised in one of the ad hocs that I have attended, and there were a discussion in that particular point, on that particular point, when the Saudi delegate raised the question whether this organization that was mentioned or mentioned, I mean, in the footnote is comprehensive, because the footnote says, as I remember when actually I dictated it myself to the group in Guadalajara 2010, we said including but not limited to, and then we listed the organization. So this including but not limited to raised the question by the Arab group whether these are comprehensive, whether we should or they should consider adding more relevant organizations to the discussion as a sort of negotiating to delete it altogether or to keep it. The other area that were as well controversial, when again the Arab group as well as I think the African group tried to add some identifiers, like to name and state some of the technologies such as 5G, for instance, AI, IoT, big data, cloud computing, OTTs, and so on. And of course, this was not accepted by many other groups during the discussion, because it extends the mandate. And I remember one of the countries actually approved, yes, we mean to add these kind of identifiers for some technologies so that we can expand the mandate of the ITU as we move forward. And then of course, again, the very famous discussion on enhanced cooperation, and the fact that for some regional groups, this was not a completed task as mandated by the World Summit for Information Society, and that they would like to see more on the enhanced cooperation part through the Council Working Group for Internet, to the extent that they were proposing to make or to get out of this council group of the internet a set of recommendations, or to make it or transform the working group into a platform where decisions can be taken, and so on and so forth. So these kind of discussions, and around these kind of issues, the discussion were taken, but the result was, I think, as far as I remember, no change to any of those.
Yes,
absolutely.
Thank you, Nermeen. Wolfgang or Sam, whichever.
Yeah, there are two other issues I want to raise. ITU is known for desire to go for new business, also to justify the continuation of its existence. So, and it was the Internet of Things, and then it became cybersecurity, and it's now artificial intelligence, which is not really related to the original mandate of the ITU, which goes back in the 19th century. So, but there was an interesting debate about the cybersecurity agenda, which the GCA, which is the acronym, which was adopted in 2007 because the ITU got a mandate from the Tunis agenda on the action line on cybersecurity. So this is part of the ITU-WSIS relationship. So, and the cybersecurity agenda, you know, was drafted in 2007 in a very broad way, but the environment for cybersecurity has changed dramatically since 2007. So there was an idea and a proposal to rewrite the global cybersecurity agenda for the ITU. And this was the resolution 130, which created a lot of controversies. And the outcome is that it should not be the ITU. The ITU is not the central organization for cybersecurity. And the ITU has a role to play, as also Asas has already said, that the ITU is within the UN family, the specialized agency for IT, telecommunication, and all these issues. So the ITU plays a role, but it's not a central role. So that means cybersecurity is not the core business. So, and the debate was then what the ITU can do. And the interesting twist, what I did see was that the ITU could play a bigger role in capacity building and in enabling developing countries to deal with this issue, not in policy development for cybersecurity, but in capacity building. And I think this is a different, in my eyes, a very constructive way forward. Because capacity building in this field is welcome and needed, in particular in developing countries. As Amanda has said, nobody can follow anymore, you know, all these ad hoc groups and informal groups and things like that. So this overstretches the capacity of a lot of developing countries. And if we have more investment in capacity building for issues which are related to ITU's core business, and in particular also to cybersecurity, this could manage the ITU in a more constructive role, linked to the development, the sustainable development goals, which, you know, have still 8 years to go until 2030. And 8 years is normally the timeline for a Secretary General. So what I see, again, what I said in the early beginning, I see a shift, you know, from the T sector more to the D sector, and capacity building should be more in the center. So ITU has an important role to play, but it's not the place, you know, where the big fight on the political geostrategic fights on internet governance will take place. And cybersecurity is one of the issues. You know, with regard to the footnote, so it's the status quo. Does it matter? No. I think the relationship, the RIPE NCC, ICANN are sector members in the ITUT. They will raise their voice. They have a Secretary General which have made very public that it will look for collaboration to these ISTAR organizations. She made clear that the multi-stakeholder model for the WSIS forum of ITU will be further extended. So that means what we see is we'll see is a mix of various activities where you do not need any time the consent of all member states. So that means the Secretariat can do something on its own. And my impression is that, you know, we will see a certain move, more multi-stakeholder approach in the WSIS forum, more bilateral cooperation, you know, with sector members, in particular from the ISTAR organizations in council working groups. Then Russia is not anymore a member of the council. So that means let's wait and see whether this will have consequences. It was really a surprise. It was not a surprise that Ismailov lost the election, but that Russia didn't get the needed votes to become a member of the ITU Council. This is remarkable. Back to you.
All right, thanks. Really, I think we're running out of time, and I already have people like Mike Nelson raising their hand who want to get into the discussion. So if we could just kind of very briefly, does anybody else have anything on the resolutions in particular that they would want to add? And maybe then we could just close with a few thoughts on some of the other points I mentioned, ITRs, WSIS follow-up, and so on. And Nermeen, Sam, whichever.
I was going to talk about WSIS, so I'll wait till the next section.
Okay, great. Nermeen, anything else on the resolutions, or let it go?
No, actually, I think we covered the main highlights on the internet.
Okay, so this is Sam. So yeah, so the WSIS follow-up stuff. You know, there's a lot of push to. I mean, this is it's tied in, of course, with what the General Assembly does and all these other things. But the whole question of WSIS plus 20 review, and then WSIS plus 20 beyond 2025, and who knows, maybe we'll be doing WSIS plus 30, 40, 50. Will we be revisiting all these issues on a more expansive basis than in the past, etc.? There was a resolution on all this, resolution 140. Any thoughts on what was decided in the Plenipot with regard to WSIS and whether that matters? Sam.
Well, so the WSIS resolution doesn't include some of the more extreme proposals that happened, but they're actually the interesting stuff. And I just want to link that back to the election of Doreen and Thomas as the new Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General. I'm wondering if there's been a bit of a kind of like an Obama effect in having to Europe, like we are country people now going to head the ITU. Just as when Obama was elected, racism increased. I'm wondering if some member states that are worried about the Western view of technologies have been trying to push through certain things through resolutions and decisions to kind of counter what they are worried the leadership will do, the same way that the Western countries were worried when Touré was in charge, etc. So with WSIS, there was an attempt to try and have, in some of the proposals, to have ITU be the lead, take on a lead role in the WSIS plus 20 review. That kind of got diluted back. But I found it kind of interesting that this whole debate about WSIS was happening when we've got the Global Digital Compact coming up. And people think I'm a little bit crazy, but I'm wondering if WSIS is even going to happen after 2025. Will the Global Digital Compact render it obsolete? That's not something anyone's really talked about. But given how much of the WSIS key documents are the foundation for ITU's activities or the multi-stakeholder process, if WSIS doesn't continue, what happens? So that's kind of just a thought piece for look towards the future. Should we be thinking about this WSIS process so much when there is something that predates it, the summit of the future, that could render it irrelevant and create a new process? And I do wonder if that's why some of the member states were trying to maneuver some of the WSIS preparation for that WSIS plus 20 to try and make sure that ITU remains a key player in whatever happens post 2024.
Thanks, Sam. There are other people here like Ambassador Karklitz and others who expressed views about the WSIS stuff. Maybe we can come back to that when we open it to the floor. And just really quickly to just finish off, the International Telecommunications Regulations. Once again, the Plenipotentiary has agreed to have another in an endless series of expert groups to debate whether or not it's unacceptable to have two sets of ITRs out there in the world, one from the 1988 WOTC that's been signed by everybody, and one from the 2012 WICET, which was signed by only 89 countries. And so there's a constant demand to revisit these issues and have another negotiation. And one has to wonder, is there any realistic possibility for anything to be agreed on a broadly inclusive multilateral basis? Or are we just doomed to repeat ad infinitum the same old debates, the same locked-in positions, etc., with regard to the telecom regulations and their application to the internet? Anybody have a view on that real quickly? Any of the panelists? Wolfgang, you've paid attention to these things closely.
Yeah, I think the ITR is irrelevant. So that means we have lived since Dubai with the WOTC document from 1988, and the ITRs from 2012 from Dubai. And if you talk to network people, they say, okay, does it matter? So that means there was never enough signatures beyond 100 or something like that for the Dubai ITRs. So, and also the legal advisor said, you know, it's not a problem that we have different international telecommunication regulations. And if some member states want to have a new one, let's do them. So the mandate of the expert group did expire. And so it's now a little bit unclear whether there will be a new expert group and then they can discuss another 4 years and come back in 8 years with another proposal, probably to have another attempt in 2035 or something like that. But in my eyes, this is irrelevant and it's not in the center. And, you know, the days of Dubai are over.
Okay. I think it's time, as I said, we have a lot of really good people in the participating out there I see on the list. So I'd like to open it to the floor. There's obviously much more that could be said about all this. The Plenipotentiary covers a huge amount of ground, and there were a lot of topics that we couldn't really dig into, from cybersecurity to discussions around OTT and all that. But we've gotten a broad taste of the meeting and its views of its consequences. Let's now go to a broader discussion. Mike Nelson has had his hand up. I'd like to recognize him to start. And when people speak, could you please introduce yourself in one sentence so everyone knows who you are? Thanks.
And I'm Mike Nelson, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, and have been very involved in the Internet Governance Forum and WSIS for many years. I had a whole bunch of questions. Luckily, some of them have already been answered, particularly Samantha did a good job of talking about the ITU's relationship with some of the other things at the UN. And I posted in the chat a question about that would be very helpful to me, which is, where should we go if we really want to understand what some of these resolutions said and what the fights were? Has anybody tried to synthesize that in layman's language? And so just answer that in the chat if you have some good resources that would be suitable for my colleagues who don't go to ITU meetings. But the last question is actually very minor, but it's all about the gossip in the hallways, and particularly about gossip regarding the future of the IGF and whether anybody's going to Addis Ababa, whether there's going to be an IGF in Moscow, just any intelligence that people picked up about the thoughts on IGF going forward.
Okay, thanks. You know what? Actually, why don't we take a few questions together in a cluster, and then people can respond to that. Do we have other folks with Robin Mansell? Lovely to hear from you. Robin, you're muted.
Hi, everyone. Robin from the London School of Economics. I didn't follow this Plenipot very closely, but I have over the years followed the way these things develop. I guess the observation I have is, particularly taken by Wolfgang's comment that in the chat, that perhaps the fact that the Plenipot is not deemed to have failed is a success this time round, and I can get along with that. But I think from a kind of a geopolitics point of view, this is a huge organization, as many people have pointed out. It's many-headed, and it'd be highly unusual if nation states were not trying to make things happen or stop things from happening. And I guess it's a similar question to Mike, in the sense that I would really like to get a fix on the sorts of things that would be different if we didn't have a Plenipot. And what would be blocked, what would be facilitated? And I'll stop there. That's the kind of question that I would like to see answered. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. I like counterfactual history, and that's what if there were no Plenipot is certainly, or no ITU is certainly one. Of course, it should always be recognized that ITU does a great many other things, and that the radio spectrum stuff is absolutely essential and recognized by all parties to be essential. The technical assistance is very important. So the internet stuff is just like one aspect. Who else do we have out there who would like to weigh in? There are a lot of interesting folks. I don't know. While you're thinking about it, I see a question also to put on the table from the chat from Tay. It says, given the fragility of several of the developed world democracies, what do you see happening to the ITU, internet governance, and cybersecurity if ultra right wing in France, the US, and other join Italy's fascists in taking control of those governments? That's certainly an interesting question as well. So the domestic politics of key countries is also definitely a consideration here as we look to the future of international governance. Why don't we get responses from people to the questions that have been posed so far, and then we'll come back around and see if there are more. In whichever order, responding to Mike's questions, including about Plenipot and IGF future, Robin on understanding what would be different without, and Tay on the domestic politics. Wolfgang?
IGF future, IGF plus. Very, very good question. Let's wait for Addis Ababa and then for Japan. But you know, after listening to also Doreen supporting the WSIS forum and taking into account the limited resources which both the IGF Secretariat has and which the WSIS, which the ITU has, all the money goes into the construction of the new building. I could imagine that the IGF Plus could be a combination of the traditional IGF and the WSIS forum. So they have the Secretariat in Geneva. You know, originally the WSIS forum was a discussion on the implementation of the action lines from Tunis. So, and then it was designed by some people in the ITU as a counter IGF and to have a top-down controlled mechanism from intergovernmental organizations like UNESCO, UNDP, and ITU. And they invited some stakeholders, while the IGF was more a bottom-up process. So if this will change now, I could imagine that the WSIS forum becomes part of the intersessional work, and we see a more or less, you know, going together from the under the framework of an IGF plus, that the ITU becomes more active in IGF processes, and the IGF includes the WSIS forum more into its intersessional work. But that's just in speculation, and it's very open. Also, you know, how the new leadership panel under the chairmanship of Windsurf and, you know, will take the lead. So it's a leadership panel. So who leads it? It's Amadip? Is it Wind? Is it somebody else? So open questions. So I cannot answer it.
Mike is just following up Wolfgang to ask about merging the WSIS forum and the IGF, which for some people would be problematic. Okay, anyway. Nermeen.
So I would just like to reflect on Mike's question regarding a good resource maybe for explaining the issues that has been discussed within the plenipotentiary. And I have copied in the chat the intra-society matrix, where we analyzed before the conference the key issues that we assume would be raised as not controversial, but you know, the hot topics on the agenda, I would say. I think this is a very, very useful material that could be helpful, I mean, for any expert, either involved in the field or even outside the community of the internet. So I'm just referring to the matrix of the ISOC. Back to you.
Sam?
Make sure I unmute myself. I will also, Mike, write some analysis of the Plenipot stuff. My website has gone down, and because it happened and, you know, there was way too much happening at Plenipot, I haven't resurrected it, but once it's resurrected, I will put some analysis up there. Looking to the question about IGF's future and whether it's a good idea to merge it with the WSIS forum, I think if we stop playing favorites with what our favorite forum is, whether it's ITU or IGF, the multi-stakeholder model, if we think about it rationally, it makes sense to take the best of both elements. And maybe it's the GDC forum, the Global Digital Compact forum. Because if you look at the issues being discussed at IGF and the issues being discussed at WSIS forum these days, there really isn't that much difference. So it makes sense to pool resources and perhaps as part of this Summit of the Future Global Digital Compact, create something that is more robust and meets the needs of today's world.
Thanks, Sam. You know, that's a very controversial topic, of course, that was debated a lot, and many people around the IGF would worry about having the process controlled through the ITU rather than as a separate thing. As Nigel Hickson just said in the chat, they serve different purposes, and one could say WSIS forum is more broadly defined than internet governance. But I'd like to go back to Robin and Mike, you know, both, I mean, you raised the question I alluded to at the outset. There are certainly people here and not participating who look at all this activity and say, how much does this stuff really matter? How much does the ITU arrangements actually, and the negotiations and discussions there, really impact anything operationally around the internet? The internet continues to be, ICANN continues to do its work around names and numbers. Other actors in the iStar community perform their functions. The net's running. There's discussions out there. Governments are saying they'd like this or that, but nothing operationally can be agreed because there's no way for consensus on new strict regulations or anything else. So how, you know, can anybody just speak quickly to the question? I mean, how do you argue the case that this stuff really does ultimately matter and is consequential? Yeah, Sam.
Yeah, I think it does matter because developing countries particularly look to ITU. So if ITU is issuing recommendations, it's quite possible for those recommendations to be instituted into national legislation. And we've seen through things like GDPR, that's a European regulation, but it affects companies operating all around the world. So if you had countries taking on particular initiatives or recommendations that come out of various ITU activities, that could help further fragment the internet if certain groups, I mean, at one of the previous ITU meetings, there's been discussion about blocking multinational platforms from developing countries so that they can develop their own digital markets. So if they did that, that would start to fragment how current internet platforms work. So these are the sorts of things that do have an impact. It is something that as Western countries, they may not find ITU regulations particularly, or recommendations particularly useful, but for developing countries trying really hard to enter this sphere and be somewhere near equal to the bigger players, they will see ITU advice as the way to change things for their improvement, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Nermeen, anything on this point?
Yes, I would actually agree again that the developing country would look high to the ITU as a trustworthy platform where governments take the lead, so they will feel, and they feel actually quite confident of whatever decision or discussion that takes place there, and they are trying to find for themselves a role in general. Being, you know, as we always say, the 2nd billion will come from Africa, for example, so the African governments are loaded with how to develop their internet communities and internet industry, and they believe that the ITU can help or should help them more into that area. But I think the more they get engaged in other platforms as well, the more they see the benefit of engaging in different platforms, and they can benefit from here and from there and within the mandate or in the realm of the entity that they are interacting within. So this is just quick notes. Back to you, Will.
Okay, and just, by the way, nobody has picked up on Tay's question about domestic politics and whether shifts within countries, including towards a more nationalistic and protectionist sort of mindset, might impact on global internet governance, whether in the ITU or elsewhere. Does anybody have a view on that question, or should we just leave it lingering out there as a...
Yes, Bill, this was exactly my impression also from Bucharest. You know, when Trump started a couple of years ago and said America first, what I hear now also, you know, in this private discussion is it's now not only America first and Russia first and China first, it's also Botswana first and Ghana first and Algeria first. So that means developing countries feel now the pressure in their domestic policies, and they, you know, we have to do something, and they are looking for the development of a domestic policy which fits their interests, and they benefit from global regulations only insofar they help them to settle national problems. So, and insofar, you know, this shift, you know, that the wish for a big multilateral arrangement which benefits all nations, you know, is probably not the first priority anymore, because we have to deal with our concrete national issues and we have to look for solutions. If multilateral arrangements are helping us, that's okay, but that our first priority is our national priorities. So, and this was also a little bit underlying the why in the 102 resolution you have now the CCTD paragraph from the Tunis agenda, which strengthens the sovereign right of governments to do their own thing. And that's why I mentioned it in an earlier statement. Let's wait and see whether this will have consequences.
Thanks, Wolfgang. I think it's a really important question, and actually it feeds into the next session we're going to do on fragmentation, because as more and more countries move towards a more nationalistic, state-led kind of mindset on a lot of these issues, this is not the 1990s anymore. This is not the era when everybody thought in terms of globalization and we'll just establish rules harmonizing open markets everywhere. There's a massive retrenchment going on in a lot of contexts, and it's becoming more and more difficult, and this raises questions for international cooperation and what kind of international institutions we may have with regard to the internet and other technologies. So I think it's definitely something to maybe even merit a whole discussion in another session. But okay, well, look, I think we're coming up on towards the end. We've got 4 minutes left on our clock, so it would have been great to get more discussion, but I think we've had a good input from people out there. So let me just wrap this up by saying that I very much agree with the views that were expressed, that indeed, you know, even if the ITU is not going to be adopting strict new treaties that impose regulations on the internet, etc., what goes on in the ITU with regard to internet issues does matter. It leads to coalition building among governments. It leads to sort of conceptual convergence and policy convergence among countries. It leads to the development of policy models outside ITU that can feed into other things, etc. So I think it is really important to keep an eye on this. And I think obviously the view of many people seems to be that with the new leadership and so on, that maybe this was a kind of hopeful sign that ITU's engagement with internet governance could be moving in a more interesting direction. So we'll see. So listen, thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Let me just remind you by way of closing that we will have a next webinar in this series on internet fragmentation in November. And let me turn it back then to Ellie Noam in Vevey, Switzerland, for a closing benediction. Ellie?
Oh, well, thank you. Actually, not a benediction, Bill. My conclusion is this has been an opening an important opening session for this important seminar event. I got a lot about it. I got a lot about the process, the procedure, the various bodies, the events, the platforms. And I'm perfectly willing to accept and to agree that to the proposition that these processes are important. And to echo Mike Nelson's request for recommendations, how to get summaries understandable for regular people about exactly what these resolutions was. But I got less clear what was the substance of what was decided. So I want to ask you also speakers and others to direct the rest of us to what the implications are to the industries, to the network providers, the online video, the mobile providers, and to issues and principles of freedom of expression, privacy, development, etc. So I'd like you to hopefully to steer us in the right direction. Now, as to the announcement of next events, Bill already mentioned November 17, Internet Fragmentation Reconsidered. We also have in November 2 other events. One is public, and that is the about media entrepreneurship in times of global uncertainty by Marcus Englert, who is the CEO of a company called Rocket Internet of Germany. So I hope that you had a good time. Bill, thank you very much. Jason, thank you very much for all that you've done for this event. And speakers as well as audience, thank you. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you very much. We're right
Bye-bye,
on
thank
time.
you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.